All right, so today we're going to be diving into something that I think hits pretty close to home for a lot of us. It's about our digital lives and specifically what happens when they kind of go off the rails. The article you're looking at today starts off with a pretty relatable nightmare. Imagine getting locked out of your bank account, not just for a couple hours, but for like an entire month.
Yeah, and that actually happened to the author of this article. It was actually their Facebook account, but it got them thinking about like big tech and how it's getting more and more involved in the financial world.
Exactly. And the article is called Big Tech or Big Curse on the Banking Experience. It's a really interesting question, like, do we really want these same companies that control our social media, what we buy online? Do we want them to be in charge of our money too?
Yeah, it's a really good question, especially, these days when so much of our lives revolves around these platforms.
All right, so let's get into what happened to the author. They got hacked, which is scary enough on its own right. Someone got a hold of like an old email address that was linked to their Facebook, and they requested access. And basically, as the author puts it, chaos ensued.
Yeah, and this wasn't just like a random Facebook account. This is like their main profile. They use it for, talking to friends and family, of course, but also to run their business page. They even used it to access other services like Oculus VR.
Wow. And getting locked out for 30 days? I mean, in today's world, a month feels like a year. Everything is so instant right now. So waiting that long for something as important as your main online account to get fixed, it just seems crazy.
Well, it kind of shows you just how much we depend on these big platforms and how little control we actually have when something goes wrong. The author makes a good point about how it's almost like you built your house on someone else's land and then suddenly they change the locks and you're just stuck.
That's a perfect analogy. And what's even more unsettling is that the author uses this term monopolies to describe these tech giants. They basically felt trapped because their whole life online, and to some extent, their actual livelihood, was tied to this one single platform.
And that kind of brings us to the core of the article, this personal experience, getting locked out of Facebook. It becomes this lens through which the author starts looking at big tech and how they're moving into the world of finance.
And their concern is that it'll be the same problems all over again, right?
Yeah.
Except now, instead of just being annoying, it could be like financially devastating because we're talking about people's money.
Exactly. Imagine not being able to access your social media for a month. That's already a pain. Now imagine that same situation, but it's your bank account. Suddenly, it's not just an inconvenience, it's a potential disaster.
That's a scary thought. And the article even mentions some real-world examples that are happening right now. The author talks about hearing about these new online banks, or neobanks, I think they're called, where people are getting their accounts frozen for like no reason and they have no idea how to get help or get their money back.
Yeah, and even though neobanks might seem kind of separate from these big tech companies, they often use the same technology and data-driven approaches. Plus, a lot of these big tech companies are already starting to get involved in financial services anyway.
So it's not just some far-off future we're talking about, it's happening right now. Big tech is moving into finance. And this author is really urging us to think critically about what that means for all of us.
Yeah, are we really okay with the potential downsides of all this? That's the big question this article is asking us to think about.
Yeah, it really feels like we're at this point where the convenience and all the innovation that big tech offers, it's like running headfirst into all these worries about control and privacy and, maybe even like our financial security down the line.
Yeah, I think you put that really well. It's so easy to just get caught up in all the bells and whistles, the promise of a better digital experience and all that. But we really need to take a step back and ask ourselves, is it really worth it?
Exactly. How much of our financial data are we really willing to give up? What if there's like a glitch in the system? Or even worse, what if somebody's intentionally manipulating things behind the scenes?
And those aren't just like hypotheticals, We've seen cases where algorithms have been used to actually discriminate against certain groups or, just make existing inequalities even worse.
And the author brings up a really good point about how big tech's record on privacy and data security. Well, it's not exactly perfect, is it?
Not at all. I mean, just think about all the data breaches and privacy scandals we've seen over the years. Are we really comfortable handing over our financial information to these same companies, knowing that no system is ever going to be 100% secure?
It's like taking a huge gamble with really high stakes. I mean, imagine your account gets flagged as suspicious by some algorithm, and suddenly you can't access any of your money.
Or even think about the potential for targeted advertising based on like what you buy. Like imagine checking your balance after buying something expensive, and then suddenly you're getting bombarded with ads for loans with these crazy high interest rates.
That is so creepy. It's like It crosses the line from convenience to straight-up manipulation. And that's not even getting into the whole issue of monopolies, which the author seems to think is a huge warning sign.
Right. The worry is that as big tech gets more and more involved in finance, they'll just end up stifling competition and squashing innovation, just like they've been accused of doing in other industries.
No, instead of having lots of different choices when it comes to financial services, we end up with just a few giant tech companies calling all the shots.
Exactly, and that could mean fewer options for consumers, higher fees, and less accountability across the board. And we can't forget, these companies, at the end of the day, they're driven by profit, not necessarily by what's best for the people who use their services.
It's a lot to think about. So where do we go from here? We can't exactly just unplug from the digital world, can we?
You're right, but I think being aware of the situation is a really good first step. The more we know about the potential risks and the trade-offs involved, the better decisions we can make. Decisions that are, in line with our own values.
So being more careful about which companies we trust with our data and our finances.
Exactly. Don't be afraid to ask questions, read the fine print. And don't be afraid to look into other options. There are still plenty of traditional banks and credit unions out there, places that really prioritize customer service and privacy.
Yeah, and the author makes a good argument for supporting those smaller independent financial institutions.
Yeah.
The ones that are more focused on serving their local communities.
Right. It's about diversifying our options, not putting all our eggs in one basket, as the saying goes.
It seems like this whole thing boils down to a question of power, really. Who has it? Who controls it? And how are they using it?
And I think the author's main message is pretty clear. We need to be actively involved in shaping the future of finance. We can't just sit back and passively accept whatever big tech decides to do.
I don't know about you, but I kind of feel like we're at a crossroads here. On the one hand, you've got all this potential for amazing innovation, making things easier and more convenient. But then on the other hand, you've got these huge questions about control. Who's really in charge and who's really benefiting from all of this?
Yeah, it's like the classic story of progress, We love the idea of a better future, a future that's easier and more efficient, but we also have to be careful about the downsides, especially when you're talking about something as important as our finances.
So what do? We can't just stop technology from advancing, right? But how do we make sure we don't get swept away by all the changes?
Well, I think the first thing is to just be informed. Don't just jump into the latest fintech trend or assume that the biggest company is always the best option. Take some time to really understand what's going on, both the good and the bad.
So doing your research before you sign up for any new financial service or app?
Exactly. Read the fine print. Look into the company's history. See how they handle privacy and security, and think about whether you're comfortable with how they use your data.
And maybe even looking at some of those smaller alternative options we talked about earlier.
Absolutely. There's a whole movement happening right now focused on ethical and sustainable finance. There are companies and organizations out there that really prioritize things like transparency, fairness, and social responsibility.
That's good to hear. So it's not just about being careful or avoiding risks. It's also about supporting the kind of financial system that we actually want to see in the world.
Exactly. We have a lot more power than we think, both as consumers and as citizens. We can choose to support companies that align with our values. And we can also advocate for policies that create a more fair and accountable financial system.
It's almost like we're all working together to write the rules for this new financial world. And the choices we make today are going to have a big impact on what things look like in the future.
And that's why it's so important to keep having these conversations, to raise awareness and to give people the information they need to make good decisions.
Well, this deep dive has definitely given me a lot to think about. We've covered a lot of ground, from the author's own experience getting locked out of their account to all the bigger questions about big tech's role in finance.
We've talked about the risks, but we've also talked about the opportunities. And at the end of the day, I think the most important message is that we have the power to make a difference. We don't have to just sit back and watch things happen. We can be active participants in shaping the future of finance and making sure it works for everyone.
And on that note, I think we're going to wrap up this episode. But before we go, I want to leave you with one final thought. As you navigate the world of finance and all of the changes that are happening, remember to stay curious, stay critical, and most importantly, stay in control.